When Isabella Montgomery's secret marriage to her gardener erupts at her father's will reading, the scandal rocks New England's elite social circles. But beneath the surface of this forbidden romance lies a century of buried secrets, a mysterious inheritance, and a hidden legacy that could change the future of agriculture forever. Under the watchful eyes of Rosebrook Manor's roses, love blooms between old money and calloused hands, while dark corporate forces gather on the horizon. Isabella Montgomery stood at the towering gates of Rosebrook Manor, her childhood home, with a heaviness in her heart that even the crisp autumn breeze couldn't dispel. At 32, she was the sole heiress to the Montgomery fortune, a burden that had shaped every aspect of her life since birth. The estate's perfectly manicured gardens stretched out before her, a testament to her family's wealth and status in New England's elite social circles. But it was those very gardens that had changed her life forever. 3 years earlier, on a sweltering summer morning, Isabella had encountered Thomas Chen while he was pruning the rose bushes her grandmother had imported from England. Unlike the previous gardeners, who had maintained a respectful distance, Thomas had smiled warmly and offered her a freshly cut rose, explaining how the morning dew enhanced its fragrance. Thomas wasn't like anyone Isabella had ever met in her social circle. His hands were calloused from honest work, his clothes well worn but impeccably clean, and his eyes held a wisdom that came from seeing the world from the ground up. At 28, he had already traveled across 3 continents, working in various gardens to fund his journey, learning different cultivation techniques, and collecting stories that made Isabella's privileged world seem small in comparison. Their conversations began innocently enough. Isabella would walk the gardens early in the morning, ostensibly to check on the progress of her mother's beloved hydrangeas. Thomas would share his knowledge about each plant, and she would listen, captivated not just by the information, but by the passion in his voice. He spoke about flowers the way her father's friends spoke about stock portfolios, with deep understanding and genuine care. "Every plant has a story," he'd told her one morning, gently turning over a leaf to show her the intricate pattern of veins underneath. "Just like people, they need the right conditions to thrive. Some need constant attention, others need to be left alone, but all of them need love." Isabella's mother, Victoria Montgomery, would have been horrified to know that her daughter spent hours talking to the help. The Montgomerys had maintained their social position for generations by careful cultivation of their own. Arranged marriages, strategic business alliances, and an unwavering adherence to social protocols that were as rigid as they were unwritten. Even now, Victoria was trying to orchestrate a marriage between Isabella and Charles Whitmore III, whose family owned a chain of luxury hotels across the country. Charles was everything the Montgomerys could want in a son-in-law: wealthy, well-connected, and thoroughly boring. He spoke endlessly about golf handicaps and market trends, treating Isabella like another acquisition to be managed. But in the garden with Thomas, Isabella felt truly seen for the first time in her life. He noticed how she always touched the petals of white roses first, how she preferred the wild, untamed parts of the garden to the strictly organized flower beds, and how her eyes lit up when she spoke about her dreams of opening a botanical sanctuary for endangered plant species. Their love bloomed slowly, carefully, like the rare orchids Thomas nurtured in the greenhouse. They met in secret corners of the vast estate, sharing whispered conversations and stolen glances. Thomas taught her about soil composition and plant genetics, while Isabella shared her knowledge of art and literature. Together, they created a small, hidden garden behind the old groundskeeper's cottage, a place where social barriers dissolved among the wildflowers and herb patches. The decision to marry came during a violent summer storm. Isabella had rushed to the greenhouse, worried about the orchids Thomas had been cultivating. She found him already there, securing the windows against the wind. They worked together in the rain-drumming silence, and when the last window was fastened, Thomas turned to her, water dripping from his hair, and said simply, "I love you." They were married 2 weeks later in a small chapel 2 towns over, with only the elderly priest and his housekeeper as witnesses. Isabella wore a simple white dress, and Thomas had a wild rose in his buttonhole. They kept their marriage a secret, knowing the scandal it would cause, the damage it would do to both their lives. Thomas continued working in the gardens, and Isabella played her part as the dutiful daughter, all while they planned their escape. But fate had other plans. Isabella's father, Richard Montgomery, fell ill suddenly. The doctors diagnosed an aggressive form of cancer, giving him months at most. As he lay in his massive four-poster bed, attended by private nurses, Isabella struggled with the weight of her secret. Should she tell him about Thomas, about the happiness she had found? But every time she gathered her courage, her mother would be there, discussing treatment options or reviewing business documents, her presence a reminder of everything Isabella stood to lose. Richard Montgomery died on a Sunday morning in early spring, just as the first crocuses were pushing through the soil. The funeral was a society event, with hundreds of mourners in expensive black attire filling the family chapel. Isabella stood beside her mother, accepting condolences with practiced grace, while Thomas worked quietly in the background, ensuring the funeral flowers were perfect. Now, 2 weeks later, Isabella was returning to Rosebrook Manor for the reading of the will. Her mother had been surprisingly insistent about her presence, despite Isabella's suggestion to delay it. The family lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had hinted that there were unusual provisions that required immediate attention. As Isabella walked up the gravel driveway, she noticed Thomas working on the topiary near the front entrance. Their eyes met briefly, a world of unspoken words passing between them. How long could they keep their secret? What would happen when the truth finally came out? The great hall of Rosebrook Manor was filled with familiar faces, her mother's sisters, cousins from Boston, board members from the family company, and Charles Whitmore III, who had somehow managed to wrangle an invitation. They sat in the library surrounded by leather-bound books and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, while Mr. Harrison arranged his papers on the massive mahogany desk. Victoria Montgomery sat rigidly in her late husband's chair, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her black dress immaculate. She looked like a queen holding court, and in many ways, she was. The Montgomery fortune had grown under her guidance as much as her husband's, and everyone knew she was the true power behind the family name. "Before we begin," Mr. Harrison said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I must note that Richard Montgomery made some significant changes to his will in the months before his passing, changes that he insisted be revealed only after his death." Isabella's heart began to race. Had her father somehow discovered her secret? Had he known about Thomas all along? She glanced at her mother, but Victoria's face remained impassive, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the arms of the chair. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began to read. The initial provisions were standard: charitable donations, provisions for long-term staff, specific bequests to family members. But then he paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "To my daughter, Isabella," he read, "I leave the following letter, to be read aloud in the presence of all gathered here today." Isabella felt the room's attention shift to her. She sat straighter in her chair, forcing her hands to remain still in her lap. "My dearest Isabella," the letter began, "by the time you hear these words, I will be gone. But before I leave this world, there are truths that must be spoken, secrets that must be revealed. I have watched you all your life, seeing how you struggled under the weight of our family's expectations. I saw your mother's attempts to shape you into someone you were not meant to be, and I remained silent, believing it was for the best. But in my final months, as I walked the gardens of Rosebrook Manor, I saw something that changed everything. I saw you, truly you, for the first time. I saw your smile as you discussed plant varieties with our gardener, Thomas Chen. I saw the light in your eyes when you worked together in the greenhouse. I saw love blooming as surely as the roses you both tend so carefully. Yes, my daughter, I knew about your secret meetings, your whispered conversations, and eventually, your marriage." A gasp rippled through the room. Victoria Montgomery's face had gone pale, and Charles Whitmore III was sputtering incoherently. But Mr. Harrison continued reading, his voice steady and clear. "I had you followed after I first noticed the change in you, not out of mistrust, but out of curiosity about what had finally brought such joy to my daughter's life. When I learned of your marriage, I was not angry. Instead, I felt shame. Shame that we had created an environment where you felt you had to hide your happiness. Thomas Chen is not what your mother would consider a suitable match. He has no fortune, no social standing, no connections that would benefit our family. What he does have is a good heart, a brilliant mind, and most importantly, the ability to make you happy. In my final months, I did some research of my own." The letter continued, But Isabella barely heard the words. Her secret was out, exposed in the most public way possible. She could feel her mother's eyes boring into her, could hear the whispers starting around the room. But strangely, she felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Through the library window, she could see Thomas still working in the garden, unaware that his world was about to change forever. She wondered what her father had discovered in his research, what other revelations were waiting in the pages Mr. Harrison held in his hands. The whispers grew louder as Mr. Harrison continued reading, and Isabella caught fragments of conversation around her. A gardener? How could she? What about Charles? But above it all, she heard her father's words, carrying a message that would shake the foundations of everything the Montgomerys had built. Victoria. Montgomery's face had turned from pale to red, her carefully maintained composure cracking like fine porcelain. She gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles were white, but she remained silent, waiting for the rest of the letter to be read. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Isabella found herself holding her breath, waiting for what would come next. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison continued reading Richard's letter. My investigation into Thomas Chen's background revealed something quite extraordinary. While he has indeed worked as a gardener across 3 continents, his journey was not merely about learning cultivation techniques. Thomas Chen holds a master's degree in botanical sciences from Oxford University and has published several groundbreaking papers on sustainable agriculture under a different name. He chose to work with his hands not out of necessity, but out of genuine passion and a belief that true understanding comes from direct experience. The gardens of Rosebrook Manor have flourished under his care not by chance, but through the application of decades of research and innovation. But there is more. The Chen family, though not known in our social circles, has been instrumental in developing sustainable farming practices that have helped thousands of families across Asia. Thomas chose to make his own way, separate from his family's influence, a choice I wish I had had the courage to support in you, Isabella. Victoria Montgomery's composure finally cracked. "This is preposterous!" she exclaimed, rising from her chair. "Richard must have been confused in his final days. This gardener has clearly manipulated the situation." Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Mrs. Montgomery, please allow me to finish. There is more." "More?" Charles Whitmore III spoke up for the first time, his face flushed with anger. "What more could there possibly be? This is already a farce." Isabella sat silently, her mind reeling. She had known Thomas was educated, had sensed his deep knowledge went beyond practical experience, but he had never mentioned his degree or his family's work. She realized there was still so much she didn't know about her husband. The letter continued. "To ensure that love, true love, is given the chance to flourish at Rosebrook Manor, I have made the following provisions in my will. The entire estate, including the manor house, grounds, and controlling interest in Montgomery Industries, will be placed in a trust. This trust will be jointly managed by Isabella and Thomas Chen Montgomery with the following conditions." Victoria's face turned ashen. Several of the board members began muttering among themselves. Isabella's cousin William, who had expected to inherit a portion of the company shares, knocked over his water glass. "The conditions are as follows," Mr. Harrison read, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the growing commotion. "First, Isabella and Thomas must live at Rosebrook Manor for a minimum of 5 years, actively managing both the estate and the company. Second, the gardens must be transformed into a research center for sustainable agriculture, combining the Montgomery resources with Thomas's expertise. Third, a portion of the company's profits must be dedicated to providing scholarships for underprivileged students studying botanical sciences and environmental conservation." Isabella felt tears welling in her eyes. Her father had not only accepted her choice, he had found a way to unite her world with Thomas's, creating something entirely new in the process. But Victoria Montgomery was not finished. She strode across the room to the desk, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. "There must be some mistake. Richard would never... He couldn't have... What about the family name? Our position in society?" "Actually," Mr. Harrison interjected, pulling out another document, "Mr. Montgomery was quite clear about his wishes. He also left detailed records of conversations with various board members and financial advisors, dating back several months, discussing these changes." Suddenly, the library door opened, and Thomas stood in the doorway, still in his work clothes, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. One of the maids had fetched him, following Mr. Harrison's instructions. The room fell silent. Isabella rose from her chair, instinctively moving toward him, but Victoria stepped between them. "This is not happening," Victoria declared, her voice cold. "I will contest this, Will. The board will never accept this arrangement. Richard was clearly not in his right mind when he made these changes." Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses again. "Mrs. Montgomery, there's something else you should know. Your late husband anticipated your reaction. He left one final provision." The tension in the room peaked as Mr. Harrison pulled out a sealed envelope. "This envelope contains information that Mr. Montgomery instructed me to reveal only if the will was contested. He was quite specific about its contents and their potential impact on the Montgomery family's reputation." Victoria's face went from red to white in an instant. Whatever she saw in Mr. Harrison's expression made her take a step back. Thomas finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. "Mrs. Montgomery, I know this is a shock. I never meant to deceive anyone. I came to Rosebrook Manor because I wanted to understand American gardening traditions firsthand. Meeting Isabella, that was never part of my plan, but sometimes the most beautiful gardens grow from unexpected seeds." Several of the board members were now looking at Thomas with new interest. His educated manner of speaking, his quiet confidence, they were seeing him differently already. Isabella moved to stand beside her husband, taking his hand publicly for the first time. She could feel her mother's eyes on them, could sense the varying reactions around the room: shock, disapproval, curiosity, and even a few small smiles of support. But there was still something hanging in the air, something unresolved. What was in that final envelope? What had Richard Montgomery known that could silence Victoria so effectively? And how would the Montgomery empire change under the guidance of this unlikely pair? The afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the gardens of Rosebrook Manor waited, unaware that they were about to become the centerpiece of a revolution in sustainable agriculture. And somewhere, Isabella was sure her father was watching, finally at peace with the future of his legacy. In the tense silence that followed, Charles Whitmore III quietly gathered his things and left the library, his departure marking the first crack in the old order. A few board members followed, but most stayed, their curiosity evidently outweighing their discomfort. Victoria Montgomery remained frozen, her eyes fixed on the envelope in Mr. Harrison's hands. The family lawyer held her gaze steadily, years of professional discretion warring with his duty to his late client. "Perhaps," Thomas suggested softly, "we should continue this discussion more privately." His words, measured and diplomatic, caught several people by surprise. This was not the speech of a simple gardener, but rather that of someone well-versed in navigating delicate situations. "Yes," Victoria said suddenly, her voice tight. "Mr. Harrison, Isabella, Thomas, my study. Now." As they filed out of the library, Isabella caught glimpses of her relatives huddled in whispered conversation. Her cousin William was already on his phone, no doubt spreading the news throughout their social circle. The Montgomery drama would be the talk of every country club and charity gala for months to come. Victoria's study was a testament to old money and power: dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and oil paintings of stern-faced Montgomery ancestors. She took her place behind the massive desk, a position she had occupied countless times when dealing with family crises. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't in control. "Before you say anything else," Victoria began, her voice carefully controlled, "I want to hear from Thomas himself. Who are you really? And what are your intentions with my daughter and this family's legacy?" Thomas stood straight, his work clothes incongruous in the formal setting, but his bearing dignified. "My full name is Dr. Thomas Chen Wei, though I've gone by Thomas Chen since coming to America. My family's work in sustainable agriculture spans 3 generations, but I chose to step away from the family business to pursue my own research." He paused, glancing at Isabella before continuing. "I never intended to hide my background. I simply wanted to be judged on my own merits, not my family's name or achievements. Working with plants, understanding them at the most basic level. That's always been my passion. When I came to Rosebrook Manor, it was meant to be just another step in my research. Meeting Isabella changed everything. Isabella squeezed his hand, remembering all their conversations in the garden, seeing them now in a new light. How many times had he shared complex botanical theories with her, carefully explaining them in ways she could understand? As for my intentions, Thomas continued, I love your daughter, Mrs. Montgomery. Not her name, not her fortune, but her. Her kindness, her curiosity, her genuine desire to make a difference in the world. What Mr. Montgomery proposed in his will, turning Rosebrook Manor into a research center, that's something Isabella and I had dreamed about, though we never imagined it could become reality. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. If I may, there's something else you should all know. Richard Montgomery didn't make these decisions lightly. He spent his last months not just investigating Thomas, but also looking into the future of Montgomery Industries. The company's traditional investments in real estate and banking are stable but stagnating. However, the agricultural technology sector, particularly sustainable farming solutions, is projected to grow exponentially in the coming decades. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting Richard planned all this? That this arrangement is about business? Not entirely, Mr. Harrison replied, but he saw an opportunity to secure both his daughter's happiness and the company's future. The Chen family's innovations in sustainable farming are highly regarded in Asia and Europe. A partnership could open new markets for Montgomery Industries. A partnership? Victoria's voice dripped with sarcasm. You mean handing over control of everything we've built to a man who's been pretending to be a gardener? Mother, Isabella spoke up, her voice firm. Thomas wasn't pretending. He chose to work as a gardener because he believes in understanding every aspect of his field. How many of your society friends can say they truly understand the work their wealth is built on? Victoria flinched at her daughter's words. She turned to look out the window, where the gardens of Rosebrook Manor stretched out in the late afternoon sun. Those gardens had been her pride and joy, a symbol of the Montgomery family's refined taste and social position. Now she was being asked to see them as something entirely different, a laboratory, a classroom, a bridge between two worlds. The envelope, she said finally, not turning around. What's in it, Mr. Harrison? The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Are you sure you want to know, Mrs. Montgomery? Once certain information becomes part of the official record, just tell me. Mr. Harrison carefully broke the seal and removed several documents. As he scanned them, his eyebrows rose slightly. It appears Mr. Montgomery conducted a rather thorough investigation into the early days of Montgomery Industries, particularly the period when your father-in-law was expanding the company in the 1960s. Victoria's shoulders stiffened. That was a long time ago. Yes, Mr. Harrison agreed. But some of these land acquisition deals, especially those involving small family farms, well, the methods used weren't exactly... Enough. Victoria raised her hand. I understand. She finally turned back to face them, her expression unreadable. The proud Montgomery matriarch seemed to age years in those few moments, the weight of past decisions settling heavily on her shoulders. Thomas took a step forward. Mrs. Montgomery, whatever happened in the past, that's not what this is about. This is about the future, not just of the Montgomery family, but of sustainable agriculture and the communities it can help. Victoria studied him closely, seeing perhaps for the first time not an interloper, but a man of education and principle. Her gaze shifted to her daughter, who stood beside her husband with a quiet confidence that had never been there before. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses through the study's open window. Outside, the gardens waited, holding their secrets, ready for transformation. But Victoria Montgomery had one more card to play, one last revelation that would test the foundations of this newfound understanding. There's something else you should know, Victoria said, opening a drawer in her desk. She withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Since we're all being so honest today. Isabella recognized the journal immediately. It had belonged to her grandmother, Charlotte Montgomery. She'd often seen her grandmother writing in it during long afternoons in the garden. But after Charlotte's death 5 years ago, the journal had disappeared. Your grandmother, Victoria began, her voice softer now, was not always a Montgomery. She came from a farming family in Vermont. Your grandfather met her while buying land for his first real estate development. Thomas and Isabella exchanged glances. Even Mr. Harrison leaned forward slightly in his chair, Charlotte was working as a gardener on her family's farm. Victoria continued, a hint of irony in her voice. James Montgomery fell in love with her despite his family's objections. Sound familiar? She opened the journal to a marked page and began to read. Today, James asked me to marry him among the wild roses. His father is furious, says a farmer's daughter has no place in the Montgomery family. But James doesn't care about my background. He sees me, not my social status. Still, I worry. The Montgomerys are different from my family. Their world operates by rules I'm only beginning to understand. Victoria closed the journal. Charlotte wrote this in 1955. She went on to become one of the most respected women in our social circle. No one ever knew about her humble beginnings. She recreated herself, learned to navigate our world, and eventually helped build Montgomery Industries into what it is today. Isabella felt tears welling in her eyes. She'd been close to her grandmother, but Charlotte had never shared this part of her past. The gardens, Victoria gestured toward the window, were Charlotte's domain. She used her knowledge of farming to create something beautiful, something that fit our world while staying true to her roots. I watched her do it. I learned from her. When I married Richard, she took me under her wing, taught me how to be a Montgomery. She turned to Thomas. Did you know that the rose varieties you've been tending were originally developed by Charlotte? She experimented with crossbreeding, creating flowers that were both beautiful and hardy. She never published her work, never sought recognition. She understood that sometimes influence is more powerful when it's subtle. Thomas nodded slowly, respect dawning in his eyes. The Montgomery Blue, the rose variety that's unique to these gardens. I've always wondered about its origin. The genetic characteristics are remarkable. Yes, Victoria smiled faintly. Charlotte's masterpiece. She created it the year Isabella was born. She paused, running her fingers along the journal's worn spine. I fought this so hard because I thought you were trying to destroy everything we've built. But maybe you're more like Charlotte than I realized. Mother, Isabella began, but Victoria held up her hand. Let me finish. Charlotte left this journal to me with specific instructions. If ever another gardener captured a Montgomery's heart, I was to read it. Somehow she knew this might happen again. The study fell silent except for the distant sound of birds in the garden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, and the air felt heavy with the weight of revelations. There's more, Victoria said, turning to another marked page. Charlotte left a detailed plan for transforming the East Gardens into an experimental growing space. She had theories about sustainable farming that were decades ahead of her time. But James, your grandfather, wasn't ready to associate the Montgomery name with something so common as farming. Thomas stepped closer to examine the journal, his professional interest evident. These notes, they're incredibly sophisticated, especially for that time period. The companion planting arrangements, the natural pest control methods. Which brings me to my proposition, Victoria straightened in her chair, some of her old authority returning. Instead of fighting this change, what if we embrace it, but on our terms? Charlotte's work could be the bridge between the Montgomery legacy and your vision for the future. Mr. Harrison, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. That would certainly help smooth things over with the board, a connection to the family's history, a continuation rather than a disruption. But Isabella noticed something in her mother's expression, a slight tension around her eyes that suggested there was still more to come. Victoria Montgomery hadn't maintained her position at the top of society by playing all her cards at once. However, Victoria continued, confirming Isabella's suspicion, there are certain conditions we need to discuss. Conditions that Charlotte herself outlined in this journal. The sunlight caught the golden threads in the carpet, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change, much like the truth itself. Outside, the gardens of Rosebrook Manor waited, holding not only Thomas and Isabella's future, but also the secrets of the past. And somewhere, in the space between old money and new vision, between tradition and innovation, a path forward was beginning to emerge. Victoria turned to a final marked page in Charlotte's journal, her fingers trembling slightly. Charlotte's conditions are specific. She writes here that if her work was ever to be continued, it must be done under 3 non-negotiable terms. She cleared her throat and read, First, the Montgomery Blue Rose must remain exclusive to Rosebrook Manor. Its genetics must never be commercialized. This flower represents more than beauty. It's a symbol of how love can bridge two worlds. Second, the experimental gardens must provide apprenticeships for young people from farming families, giving them the same chance I had to cross social boundaries. And third, Victoria paused, her voice catching slightly. Third, Isabella prompted. The third condition is the most challenging, Victoria continued. Charlotte stipulated that if her agricultural research was ever revealed, the full story of her background must also be made public. She writes, "No more hiding, no more shame. The truth about my origins must be told, so others will know that the Montgomery legacy is built not just on wealth, but on the wisdom that comes from working the earth." Thomas stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Montgomery, these conditions, they're not obstacles, they're opportunities. Think about it. The Montgomery Blue Rose becomes not just a symbol of exclusivity, but of environmental stewardship. The apprenticeship program could identify and nurture the next generation of agricultural innovators. And Charlotte's story? It's exactly what the Montgomery name needs in today's world: authenticity, resilience, vision." Mr. Harrison nodded approvingly. From a legal standpoint, combining these conditions with Richard's will could actually strengthen our position. It shows a consistent family history of agricultural innovation, albeit a hidden one. Isabella watched her mother carefully. Victoria Montgomery had spent decades protecting the family's carefully curated image. Accepting Charlotte's conditions would mean letting go of that control, allowing the Montgomery name to be redefined in ways she couldn't fully predict. "There's something else," Victoria said, turning the journal's pages until she found what she was looking for. Charlotte left detailed notes about a series of experiments she was conducting in secret. She was working on developing drought-resistant varieties of common crops, using techniques that were far ahead of her time. Her last entry suggests she was close to a breakthrough. Thomas's eyes widened. If her research could be continued, combined with modern techniques, Mrs. Montgomery, this could be revolutionary. Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that held so many secrets. The late afternoon light painted the flowers in shades of gold and amber, creating an almost ethereal scene. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its usual sharp edge. "I spent years watching Charlotte tend these gardens. She would talk to the plants, sing to them sometimes, when she thought no one could hear. I never fully understood her connection to this place until now." She turned back to face them. "But there's one more thing you need to know about Charlotte's work." She reached into her desk drawer again and pulled out a small sealed box. Charlotte left this with strict instructions that it should only be opened when her true story was finally revealed. I've honored that request for all these years, but now... The box was made of dark wood, intricately carved with patterns of roses and vines. A small silver key lay beside it. As Victoria lifted the key, the atmosphere in the study grew thick with anticipation. Whatever was in that box had been important enough for Charlotte Montgomery to keep secret for decades. Isabella moved closer to Thomas, their hands finding each other instinctively. Mr. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, legal pad ready. The moment felt weighted with possibility, and perhaps a touch of danger. After all, family secrets once revealed had a way of changing everything. Victoria inserted the key into the lock, and the subtle click seemed to echo through the room. The lid opened with a soft creak, revealing its contents at last. Inside lay a bundle of letters, a small leather pouch, and what appeared to be a carefully preserved seed packet labeled in Charlotte's elegant handwriting. "Oh my," Victoria breathed, lifting out the seed packet with trembling hands. "I never imagined. Charlotte, what were you really doing all those years?" The secrets of Rosebrook Manor's gardens were about to run deeper than anyone had suspected, and the true legacy of Charlotte Montgomery was finally ready to emerge from the shadows. But as the sun began to set outside the study windows, casting long shadows across the room, it became clear that some revelations come with their own price and their own responsibility. Victoria carefully unfolded the aged seed packet, revealing several dark, unusual-looking seeds nestled inside. Thomas leaned forward, his professional interest immediately piqued. "These aren't any variety I've ever seen," he murmured, studying them closely without touching. The size, the coloring, they're completely unique. Isabella picked up one of the letters from the box, its paper yellow with age. The date at the top read June 15, 1972. Dear James, she began reading aloud, I know you don't approve of my continued experiments, but what I've discovered could change everything. The new hybrid shows remarkable resistance not just to drought, but to multiple environmental stressors. More importantly, it appears to enhance the soil quality wherever it grows. I've never seen anything like it. Victoria withdrew another document from the box, a small leather-bound notebook filled with Charlotte's precise handwriting. These appear to be her research notes, she said, scanning the pages. She was doing more than just creating beautiful roses. She was working on something far more ambitious. Thomas gently took the notebook, his eyes widening as he read. This is extraordinary. She was decades ahead of her time. These cultivation methods, the genetic combinations she was exploring, some of these concepts are just now being validated by modern science. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. If these experiments were as successful as her notes suggest, why didn't she ever publish her findings? This could have been revolutionary even back then. Victoria's expression darkened. Because of the farming crisis of 1973, she said quietly. Several large agricultural companies were buying up family farms, pushing out small farmers with patented seeds and aggressive business tactics. Charlotte, she paused, consulting another letter. Charlotte discovered that one of Montgomery Industries' subsidiary companies was involved. Isabella gasped. Grandfather's company was part of pushing out small farmers? It was more complicated than that, Victoria replied. According to these letters, when Charlotte discovered the connection, she faced a choice: expose the truth and potentially destroy the Montgomery name, or protect her research and wait for a time when it could be used for its intended purpose, helping small farmers compete in an increasingly corporate agricultural world. Thomas was still absorbed in the research notes. These seeds, if they work as she documented, they could revolutionize sustainable farming. The ability to improve soil quality while producing drought-resistant crops, that's the holy grail of agricultural research. Victoria pulled out one final envelope from the box, this one sealed with the Montgomery family crest. Charlotte left instructions about these seeds. They are to be planted only under specific conditions, following a precise protocol she developed. And, she hesitated, they can only be planted by someone who shares both her farming heritage and the Montgomery name. All eyes turned to Isabella, who stood straighter under their gaze. That would be me, she said softly. Through marriage to Thomas, I have the agricultural knowledge, and through birth, I have the Montgomery blood. There's more, Victoria continued, reading from Charlotte's final letter. The seeds must be planted during the next blue moon, in soil that has been prepared according to her specific instructions. She writes that the timing is crucial, something about lunar cycles affecting the genetic expression of the plants. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Many traditional farming practices follow lunar cycles. Modern science is just beginning to understand the biological basis for these ancient methods. Mr. Harrison, ever practical, spoke up. The next blue moon is in 3 weeks. If we're going to do this, we need to start preparations immediately. And we need to decide how public we want to make this information. Victoria stood, walking to the window again. The gardens were now bathed in the golden light of sunset, the Montgomery blue roses gleaming like jewels. Charlotte knew this day would come, she said quietly. She knew someone would eventually bridge the gap between our world of privilege and the world she came from. She was protecting her research, yes, but she was also protecting the future. She turned back to face them. If we do this, if we reveal Charlotte's work and plant these seeds, there's no going back. The Montgomery name will be forever changed. Our social standing, our business relationships, everything will shift. Isabella squeezed Thomas's hand. Maybe it's time for that shift. Maybe this is exactly what the Montgomery legacy is supposed to become. But as they stood in that study, surrounded by the weight of history and the promise of the future, none of them could have predicted the forces that were already in motion. Outside the mansion's walls, word of the dramatic will reading was spreading through their social circles. And in the shadowy world of corporate agriculture, certain entities would soon take a very keen interest in what was happening at Rosebrook Manor. The sun had almost set now, casting long shadows across the study. In the gardens below, the first evening primroses were opening their petals, unaware that they would soon share their carefully tended soil with something extraordinary. The mystery of Charlotte Montgomery's seeds was about to unfold, But with it would come challenges that none of them could have anticipated. The next morning brought chaos to Rosebrook Manor. News vans lined the private drive, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers. Social media was ablaze with speculation about the Montgomery scandal, old money, secret marriages, and mysterious gardens making for irresistible headlines. Isabella and Thomas stood in the greenhouse, carefully reviewing Charlotte's research notes, while Victoria handled the press with practiced grace. Through the glass walls, they could see her on the front steps, elegant as ever, deflecting questions with diplomatic skill. "Listen to this," Thomas said, pointing to a particular passage. "Charlotte writes that the seeds need to be planted in a specific formation, a spiral pattern aligned with magnetic north. She references something called telluric currents and their influence on plant genetics." "Earth currents?" Isabella murmured. "Grandfather always insisted the manor was built on special ground. We thought it was just family pride, but what if—" Their conversation was interrupted by Mr. Harrison, who hurried into the greenhouse clutching a stack of papers. "We have a situation," he announced, his usual composure ruffled. "Agritech Solutions has just filed an injunction to halt any planting on the Rosebrook grounds." "Agritech Solutions?" Thomas straightened, his expression darkening. "They're one of the largest agricultural corporations in the world. They've been trying to patent drought-resistant crop varieties for years." "Yes," Mr. Harrison nodded. "And it seems they've been monitoring the Montgomery family for quite some time. They're claiming that Charlotte's research was actually conducted using their proprietary methods, which would make any resulting discoveries their intellectual property." Isabella's hand flew to her mouth. "But that's impossible! Charlotte's work predates their company by decades." "They're arguing that their founder, Marcus Sterling, shared research with Charlotte in the 1960s, before he started the company. They've produced letters suggesting a collaboration." Thomas was already shaking his head. "The timing doesn't make sense. According to these notes, Charlotte's experiments were well underway before Sterling even entered the field. Besides, her methods are completely different from anything Agritech has ever developed." A soft knock at the greenhouse door made them all turn. Victoria entered, looking impeccable despite the morning's stress. "The vultures have been temporarily dispersed," she announced. "But we have another problem. Charles Whitmore III is outside, demanding to speak with the board. He's claiming he has evidence of irregularities in the way Richard changed his will." Isabella began to protest, but Victoria held up her hand. "That's not all. I've just received a very interesting phone call from Singapore. It seems Thomas's family has some history with Agritech Solutions as well." All eyes turned to Thomas, who had gone very still. "Yes," he said quietly. 10 years ago, Agritech tried to acquire my family's research facility. When we refused to sell, they launched a campaign to discredit our work. They nearly succeeded until—" "Until what?" Isabella prompted gently. "Until we found evidence that they had been attempting to steal traditional farming knowledge from indigenous communities across Asia. We gathered documentation, prepared to expose them. But before we could, our research facility was destroyed in a mysterious fire. All our evidence was lost. Or so they thought." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small USB drive. "I've carried this with me ever since, waiting for the right moment, the right allies. Everything we discovered about Agritech is here." Victoria's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. "So, that's why you came to America. You weren't just studying gardens. You were looking for a way to fight back." "Initially, yes," Thomas admitted. "Rosebrook Manor's reputation in agricultural circles made it a natural choice for my research. Meeting Isabella, falling in love, that was never part of the plan. But now—" A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the greenhouse windows, they could see several dark SUVs pulling up the drive, men in suits emerging with purposeful strides. "Agritech's lawyers," Mr. Harrison grimaced. "They don't waste time." Victoria straightened her spine, the formidable Montgomery matriarch fully present. "Neither do we. Thomas, your evidence combined with Charlotte's research could change everything. But we have to move quickly. The blue moon is in 20 days, and if these seeds aren't planted by then—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. According to Charlotte's notes, the specific genetic properties of the seeds were tied to lunar cycles. If they missed this window, they might lose their chance forever. Isabella looked from her mother to her husband, then out at the gardens where everything had begun. The Montgomery blue roses swayed gently in the morning breeze, their unique color a testament to what was possible when tradition and innovation merged. "We need a plan," she said firmly, "not just for planting the seeds, but for protecting everything: Charlotte's legacy, Thomas's evidence, our future." As if in response, a shadow fell across the greenhouse. Through the glass ceiling, they could see clouds gathering, unusual for what had started as a clear summer morning. The air felt charged, heavy with possibility and danger. The next few weeks would test them all as they raced against time, fought legal battles, and tried to unlock the secrets Charlotte had buried in her beloved gardens. But unknown to everyone, even Victoria, there was one more secret hidden in that wooden box. A final letter, still sealed, addressed to the next generation of gardeners, waiting for the perfect moment to be discovered. As the blue moon rose over Rosebrook Manor 20 days later, its silvery light illuminated a transformed landscape. The formal gardens had been carefully redesigned according to Charlotte's specifications, with the central spiral pattern visible even in the moonlight. Isabella and Thomas stood at its heart, Charlotte's mysterious seeds ready for planting. The preceding weeks had been a whirlwind of legal battles, public relations crises, and surprising alliances. Victoria Montgomery had proven herself a formidable ally, using her social connections to rally support from unexpected quarters. When Agritech's injunction reached the courts, dozens of small farmers came forward with their own stories of corporate bullying, their testimonies strengthening the Montgomery case. The final break came 3 days before the blue moon, when Thomas's evidence about Agritech's unethical practices was mysteriously leaked to major news outlets worldwide. Victoria's slight smile when she heard the news suggested she might have had something to do with the timing. But the most significant discovery had come just that morning when Isabella found the last sealed letter in a false bottom of Charlotte's box. As she read it aloud in the greenhouse, surrounded by family and friends, her grandmother's final secret was revealed. "My dearest gardeners of the future, if you're reading this, then the time has finally come for the truth about these seeds to be known. They are not just drought-resistant or soil-enriching, though they possess these qualities. They are something far more precious. They are the last pure strain of an ancient grain that once fed civilizations. I discovered them during my farming days, preserved by my family for generations. These seeds represent hope, not for profit or power, but for a future where food cannot be controlled by corporations, where the earth's abundance belongs to everyone. When planted under the blue moon, in soil prepared with love and knowledge, they will yield a harvest that can never be patented, never be owned, only shared. This is the true Montgomery legacy I choose to leave. Not wealth or social status, but a gift to the world that must be given freely or not at all. With all my love, Charlotte Montgomery." Now, under the blue moon's glow, Isabella and Thomas worked together, planting each seed according to Charlotte's precise instructions. Victoria stood at the garden's edge with Mr. Harrison, who had brought the final court decision dismissing Agritech's claims. The gathered crowd, a mixture of society figures, local farmers, and press, watched in respectful silence. As the last seed was planted, a warm breeze swept through the garden, carrying the sweet scent of the Montgomery blue roses. Isabella straightened, taking Thomas's hand, and addressed the assembled crowd. "My grandmother understood that true wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or social standing, but in what we give back to the world. From this day forward, Rosebrook Manor will be a center for sustainable agricultural research, open to all who wish to learn. The Montgomery name will stand for innovation, generosity, and the belief that the earth's bounty belongs to everyone." Victoria stepped forward, adding her own voice. "We will continue Charlotte's work, combining traditional wisdom with modern science. The Montgomery blue rose will remain exclusive to these gardens, but its beauty will inspire a new generation of environmental stewards. As for Charlotte's seeds," she smiled, "their harvest will be shared with farming communities worldwide, ensuring food security for generations to come." Thomas squeezed Isabella's hand, "And we'll make sure the truth is never forgotten again, about Charlotte, about corporate greed, about the power of love to bridge any divide." The blue moon continued its arc across the sky, blessing the newly planted seeds with its ancient light. In the years that followed, Rosebrook Manor became famous not for its social events, but for its revolutionary contributions to sustainable agriculture. The harvest from Charlotte's seeds proved even more remarkable than she had predicted, offering hope in an increasingly unstable climate. Isabella and Thomas had 3 children who grew up with soil under their fingernails and revolution in their hearts. Victoria discovered a passion for teaching young farmers about business strategy, helping them protect themselves from corporate predators. And the Montgomery blue roses continued to bloom, their unique color a reminder that the most beautiful things grow in the space between worlds. As for the gardens themselves, they flourished as never before, becoming a living testament to the power of truth, love, and the courage to defy convention. Visitors often remarked on the special energy they felt there, particularly under a full moon when the roses seemed to glow with an inner light and the ancient grain danced in the breeze, whispering secrets of its own. The Montgomery legacy had indeed been transformed, but in becoming something new, it had actually returned to its truest roots, in the rich soil of innovation, compassion, and the eternal human desire to make the world a little bit better than we found it. And so, the story of the wealthy woman who married her gardener became not just a tale of forbidden love, but a reminder that the greatest revolutions often begin in the most unexpected places, even in a garden, under a blue moon, with a handful of sacred seeds and the courage to plant them.